Next, let's review the hypothalamus. The hypothalamus works with the pituitary gland to maintain homeostasis by mediating thirst, hormone release from the anterior pituitary, known as the adenohypophysis, hormone release from the posterior pituitary, known as the neurohypophysis, hunger, autonomic regulation, body temperature, and sexual desire. These functions can be remembered by a mnemonic that might help you out: tan hats. Now, the hypothalamus can be divided into major regions along the anterior-posterior and the medial-lateral axes. The supraoptic nucleus is responsible for making ADH, which induces the kidney to reabsorb more water. The paraventricular nucleus makes the hormone oxytocin, which mediates smooth muscle contractions in the uterus and breast during labor and breastfeeding, respectively. The lateral area and the ventromedial area mediate hunger and satiety, respectively. Leptin is a hormone secreted by adipose cells, and it inhibits the lateral area, which represses hunger and activates the ventromedial area, causing satiety. Now, the anterior hypothalamus detects increased body temperature, and it activates mechanisms to dissipate heat. The posterior hypothalamus does the opposite. It wants to conserve heat. Lastly, we'll mention the suprachiasmatic nucleus, which is right above the optic chiasm, hence the name, and this is responsible for mediating the sleep-wake cycles based on the amount of light entering the retina. The posterior pituitary is derived from the neuroectoderm, hence its other name, the neurohypophysis. It receives ADH and oxytocin made by the hypothalamus and releases them in response to stimuli. This was discussed in some detail in the endocrinology lectures. The thalamus is known as the gateway to the brain. It is split into many subdivisions, and we're going to outline the important ones here. Sensory pathways from the body enter the ventral posterolateral nucleus and project to the somatosensory cortex in the parietal lobe. Sensory pathways from the face enter the ventral posterior medial nucleus and also project to the somatosensory cortex in the parietal lobe. One way to remember that sensory of the face enters VPM is to remember that you put makeup on your face, and hence VPM. Vision enters the lateral geniculate nucleus through the optic nerve and is projected to the primary visual cortex in the calcarine sulcus of the occipital lobe. Hearing enters the medial geniculate nucleus through a complicated pathway that involves the vestibulocochlear nerve and projects eventually to the primary auditory cortex, which is deep in the temporal lobe. One way to remember this is to remember lateral for light and medial for music. The limbic system refers to the connections between various areas of the brain that mediate one's emotions, including the cingulate gyrus, the hippocampus, fornix, mammillary bodies, and septal nucleus. The way to remember the functions of the limbic system is through what's known as the famous 5 F's: feeding, fleeing, fighting, feeling, and sex. The cerebellum means little brain in Latin. The cerebellum integrates sensory inputs from the brain and spinal cord and uses it to coordinate smooth motor movements. People with disorders in the cerebellum have problems with balance and coordinating motor movements. Let's take a look at a patient. You'll note in the movie that the patient has a lack of smooth linear movement. The output from the cerebellar cortex is carried to the cerebellar nuclei via the Purkinje cells. There are 4 nuclei in the cerebellum. The dentate nuclei receive input from the lateral cerebellar hemispheres. The emboliform and globose nuclei receive input from the intermediate hemispheres, and the fastigial nuclei receive input from the vermis. Fibers from the deep nuclei send information to the cortex via the superior cerebellar peduncle. The anatomic divisions of the cerebellum include the midline vermis that mediates truncal coordination, the intermediate parts that mediate limb coordination, and the lateral parts that mediate voluntary motor planning of the extremities with the use of sensory information. One very important principle is that the cerebellar hemispheres mediate motor movements on the ipsilateral side because the pathways cross twice, once ascending through the superior cerebellar peduncle and the other time through the pyramidal decussation of the corticospinal tract in the medulla. The basal ganglia mediate descending motor systems. Deficits in the basal ganglia produce either hyperkinetic or hypokinetic movement disorders. The basal ganglia are comprised of the caudate nucleus, the putamen, the globus pallidus, the subthalamic nucleus, and the substantia nigra. The striatum refers to the putamen and the caudate, and the lentiform nucleus refers to the putamen and the globus pallidus. There are two pathways of the basal ganglia: the direct pathway, which is responsible for promoting movement, and the indirect pathway, which inhibits movement. The trick to remembering the complex interactions between the nuclei is to think back to a basic mathematic principle. A negative multiplied by a negative is a positive. So, with this in mind, let's go through the pathways. The striatum, which is composed of both the putamen and the caudate, receives excitatory stimuli from both the cortex and the substantia nigra. Some cells in the striatum have D1 receptors. These D1 receptors are excited by the dopamine that is released from the substantia nigra. These cells block cells in the globus pallidus interna. The cells in the globus pallidus interna usually are acting to inhibit the thalamus. When the D1 cells inhibit the GPI can no longer inhibit the thalamus. As we said, a negative and a negative equals a positive. So this direct pathway ends up exciting the thalamus. Now for the indirect pathway, you'll note that some cells have a D2 receptor. When these receptors receive dopamine, they send an inhibitory signal. They first act on the globus pallidus externa. This inhibits the GPE. The GPE is usually inhibiting the subthalamic nucleus. Because the GPE is inhibited, it no longer inhibits the subthalamic nucleus. This means the STN is free to activate the GPI, globus pallidus interna. When the GPI is activated, it's able to perform its usual function, which is inhibition of the thalamus. It's complicated, it's a little confusing, but just remember, the indirect pathway is inhibitory. Now let's consider Parkinson's disease. Parkinson's is caused by a loss of the dopaminergic neurons in the substantia nigra. It is a bradykinetic movement disorder. Let's watch a video of a patient with Parkinson's disease. In the video, you can notice the patient's pill-rolling tremor at rest and his masked facies. Here's another one. In this video, you're able to notice the patient's stooped posture. The Parkinsonian gait is notable for the slow initiation, but once the patient is able to start walking, he can speed up and even find it hard to stop. When patients turn, they take more steps than others would to complete the same turn. The mnemonic we've provided for Parkinson's is TRAP, which stands for tremor, cogwheel rigidity, akinesia, that is, problems initiating movement, and postural instability, meaning walking with a stooped back. The diagnosis of Parkinson's is made clinically. However, the classic finding on autopsy is depigmentation of the substantia nigra. Under the microscope, you might also see Lewy bodies, which are alpha-synuclein inclusions. Hemibolismus is caused by a lesion in the subthalamic nucleus, leading to a loss of inhibition of the thalamus by the inhibitory pathway. These patients demonstrate wild flinging movements of the extremities contralateral to the lesion. Huntington's is a hyperkinetic movement disorder. It is an autosomal dominant trinucleotide repeat disorder, meaning that offspring will have a 50% chance of inheriting the gene regardless of gender. These CAG repeats are the pieces of DNA that are inserted. With each generation there is anticipation, meaning that the onset of disease will occur at a younger and younger age. Symptoms are caused by lesions in the striatum, particularly in the caudate nucleus. The neuronal death there is due to NMDA receptor binding and subsequent glutamate toxicity. Symptoms include chorea, aggression, depression, and dementia. On brain imaging, diminished caudate nuclei leads to dilation of the lateral ventricles. Chorea is Greek for dancing, which describes what these movements look like. When you see chorea, think of a basal ganglia lesion. Athetosis is sometimes described as snake-like movements, meaning that it is slow and writhing. It is also suggestive of basal ganglia lesion. Myoclonus is a sudden, brief, involuntary muscle contraction, like a hiccup. Dystonia is a sustained, involuntary muscle contraction, such as a writer's cramp or torticollis. A tremor is a rhythmic, oscillating movement of agonist and antagonist muscles. There are three types of tremor. An essential tremor is the most common. It is most prominent when the patient's limb is held in a specific position and it disappears at rest. The tremor increases with stress and decreases with alcohol and beta blockers such as propranolol. Let's watch a video. Now, a resting tremor is worse at rest and disappears with movement. Parkinson's, as we mentioned, is characterized by a special type of resting tremor called the pill-rolling tremor. Let's watch a movie. Last, we have the intention tremor. This is brought up by tasks like finger to nose and heel to shin. These patients cannot move their limbs in a straight trajectory and frequently overshoot or undershoot the target.